Ladies and gentlemen, a whole slew of Warlock changes came into the Shadowlands over the last couple of weeks, and even some revisions to some original ones. If you watched last week's TDP, where I played Affliction, you will know that a major part of what I talked about during that video was changed literally like a couple of hours after we recorded it, which was very frustrating, and we had to sort of re-edit the video to include that change. But nonetheless, Blizzard are on the right track in general. They are very much on the right track. They're trying to solve some of the problems that all three of the Warlock specs have had. They've achieved that in many cases. They've also tried to alter some things so that they feel smoother. The gameplay feels better. And obviously, coming from a corruption world where Warlocks are one of the biggest, likely to be the biggest hit when corruption is eventually removed, they're trying to lessen that blow, ease some of the gameplay into that. They've got lots and lots of things they tried to hit. So we're going to hit all three specs in this video. You can see down below that the timestamped and segmented. If you're interested in a particular spec, feel free to do that. Let's take a look at Affliction to get us started then. So Affliction is what I played in the last TDP. You probably have some idea of how it plays if you've seen it there with the new spells like Malefic Rapture, etc. So let's go over those noticeable changes they've had. One, Doom is gone. Thank God. It just didn't have a place. Fel Domination is back. As I did show, it reduces the pet summon ability, which is now 6 seconds of cast time, down to a half-second cast time. I don't know who has added in this cast time business for summoning pets, but they clearly, there's a disconnect here between what actually happens in the game and what the developers think should happen in the game. Because often it's just not applicable to have a 6-second cast time on a pet on a class that is very, very heavily reliant on its pet. Even if it's a case of having to swap pets, you know, from interrupts to dispels, which are often actually required in many dungeons, certainly at high levels, and of course in raids, to allow Warlocks to be able to swap their pets effectively. But discounting all that stuff, which some of you may argue, well, that's your choice of what pet you go in. We've seen a lot of those kind of arguments recently. It doesn't include the fact that pet AI is still pretty garbo, and Blizz needs to recognize that, is that often you'll see pet classes having to resummon their pets just to deal with the fact that the pet AI is bugged out, they're floating in the sky, they're not coming back to you when you want them to, they're moving around, they're going into the wrong positions. Overall, this change is again trying to fix a problem they created, rather than just have pet summons just be go, 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 because sometimes literally the game makes you resummon the pet. Having 6 seconds of downtime is incredibly punishing. So it's back, so there it is. Inevitable Demise is back as a talent this time. Your Azurite Power is now as a talent. It's pretty weak sauce on its own, but it has so much potential, especially if we look at the Covenant abilities, which is something you've really got to bear in mind when we talk about class changes over the course of the Shadowlands. Is, of course, the class changes are one part of a 6-part class build process. Remember that we still have the Covenant abilities on top of that, the Covenant signature abilities, the Soul Binds. Then we have on top of that the Legendary system, and of course the armors and trinkets and things that are coming in later. So if we look at the Night Fae ability, which also revolves around buffing the damage to drain life, and also multi-targeting it, which it does interact with at this point, it's going to potentially be crazy. Right now feels a little undertuned versus Drain Soul, but that's the thing. Unstable Affliction is back again to single target. So UA has been reworked entirely. Something you guys should know, it is limited to one target, and only one of the UAs can be on a target at a time. And what it does is it's supposed to be the dots you put on on the main target, the thing you want to die. And that target will take 10% extra damage, okay? So you can throw out dots on everything, but you can only Unstable Affliction one of them, and that one will take more damage. It's not terrible, but it feels very odd. One, it doesn't have a cooldown. You can spam it and swap it around, which feels weird when it's considered. It feels like it's trying to find this place as the big spell, this important spell, but you can just swap it around as much as you want. If the target dies, though, you do get 2 shards back. Now, this was changed twice. It started off as the 1 total, then they allowed you to put it on multiple targets, and then they changed it back. Now, this is where I kind of didn't put my foot in my mouth, because that's how the game was working, but they've changed it again. A big part of the TDP was that this is going to be crazy in the hands of good players, and I personally was very excited to see that. The reason they've reverted it, now I will read what Blizzard said as the reason to revert it, is this. This is their developer notes. Even without picking talents like Siphon Life and Phantom Singularity, Affliction was unable to keep up with their dots being active on more than 3 targets. Unstable Affliction should now be used on your priority target, which causes Malefic Rapture to do increased damage to that target. And the problem you have here is that's not true, which is always a bummer. It's always a bummer when Blizzard says, hey, we're changing the spell because of this reason, and that reason not being true. It's demonstrably false. We can prove that in a heartbeat in the alpha right now, even in starter gear with crappy haste, etc. The real reason is likely to be that it created an enormous skill gap between players who could manage this effectively, utilize the shards that they have flooding into them, and then make good use of that, versus players who struggle to keep up multi-target dots. That's likely the reason, is that gulf that would be between those players who are okay and the players who are exceptional would be enormous. Now, I'm personally okay with that change if they said that. If they were to say, this UA change we made just makes the skill gulf at the top end of Affliction Warlocks huge, like really vastly huge, and that's going to create balancing problems, it's going to create all sorts of issues, it's going to push more lesser abled players to try and do something that they're really uncomfortable doing, which other classes simply don't have to deal with, then that's fine. I think that's a good reason. I think having the skill delta at the top end be too big is a problem. But instead, what they did was something that is just demonstrably false. Now, whether or not it's a case of not wanting to risk offending lesser able players who are unable to do those things, I don't know if it's more of a PR tactic, but I really dislike when they give us reasons for changes like this that don't make sense, that simply are not true, and we can prove that in a heartbeat. So Corruption now does a bit of damage when it's applied to a target. This is really good because it works with Seed of Corruption. So one of the issues we've had with Seed of Corruption is that occasionally it doesn't do damage. Originally brought in the Burning Crusade in order to be the AoE for Affliction Warlocks. It's likely still to be the AoE, Seed of Corruption. Once you get to many targets, that's likely still to be the case. But now when you actually get that Corruption out there, you will see that initial damage. You won't see the damage that doesn't affect until later. So your Seed pops and then you don't actually see any damage because ads die and things like that. That is definitely a problem that has been fixed there. So it's really nice to see. Also makes you see the corruption seem that little bit extra powerful, which is always fun. Writhing Agony now starts the Agony stack at 4 and increases the max stacks of Agony to 18, giving it a bit more immediate damage. So Agony, still your shard generator, often felt bad. Playing around with Affliction, you throw Agony up on a target, it gets to like 3 or 4 stacks before the target dies, or it never goes anywhere before it just runs out, and you're only really throwing it up for the shard generation so you can keep the rest of the spec working. Now it will actually definitely do some damage when it gets started, and it can stack even higher, so if you manage it properly, you'll get that extra big boost at the end, so really cool to see that. A really great change was Nightfall. It scales slightly more with Corruption is on multiple targets, so if you're not aware of the background mechanics of how a lot of things work, that's totally okay. But basically, Nightfall could proc off Corruption ticks. So when your Corruption ticks and does damage, then you have a chance to generate a Nightfall. They had a very serious diminishing return on that when you put multiple Corruptions out. They've actually backtracked that now so that Nightfall is far more readily available if you take it. They really do kind of want you to go to a Shadow Bolt playstyle. I don't think they're quite there yet, at least in my gameplay. I'm going to show you I'm going to explain to you why that is, but it is still nice to see that should you like the Shadow Bolt gameplay, and I personally do, when I mained a Warlock in the Burning Crusade, Nightfall was super fun for me. But obviously with the changes they've made to Drain Soul, making it a filler spell rather than the execute spell, which I personally think is the best way around this, Nightfall was kind of very, very cool to have that. So having Nightfall back is great, although playing around with Shadow Bolt in dungeons, sorry, Blizz, it's not quite there yet. It's not quite there yet. Deathbolt has been moved to the PvP, which is great, so it's gone. Deathbolt is gone. So Shadow Embrace. Okay, so Shadow Embrace is something that was in the game for a really long time, and then it kind of took a backseat, and it is now baseline. It's a baseline part. So what it is a debuff that you put on the target that gives you an extra total 9% additional damage when you get 3 stacks of Shadow Embrace, all right? So 3% per. How do you apply Shadow Embrace? Via Shadow Bolt or Drain Soul. So when you Shadow Bolt a target, that will give it 1 stack of Shadow Embrace, 3% additional damage. 2 more, that's the 3 stacks, that's your 9%, and then you refresh it after that point. One of the obvious issues with this, outside of, say, a single target fight, is that Shadow Bolt needs 3 casts in order to get Shadow Embrace up. It's obviously a lot of damage at 9%. Drain Soul does this way, way quicker because it applies every tick of Drain Soul. So it just demonstrably makes Drain Soul better now that this is a bigger thing for Affliction again. And kind of pushes Shadow Bolt away. One of the issues I definitely had while playing around with Shadow Bolt in dungeons is that, and even in outdoor content, in world content, is this that you don't Shadow Bolt things often enough to make use of a Shadow Embrace, and it just feels like you're losing damage. I do know that during Cataclysm, when I was also a main Warlock, maintaining Shadow Embrace on multiple targets was a sign of a good Warlock. Again, that good skill delta at the top end is to manage that. And likelihood is, if you are going to be doing, say, a cleave fight, you will be using Shadow Bolt, and being able to manage Shadow Embrace is once again a decent thing. So that's really nice to see. It's just noticeably easier to use it with Drain Souls. It stacks almost immediately. So it's much better when you start multi-targeting, things like that. Now, one thing that's kind of looking dominant, at least in its talent row, is that Dark Caller is a new talent that replaces Shadow Embrace. It reduces the cooldown of Dark Glare by a whole minute. Now, the reason I'm skeptical about stuff like this and why it looks like it just defaults those talent rows is that it means your Dark Glare lines up completely perfectly with Dark Soul in the next talent row. And that synergy is extraordinarily good. It allows you to put out some significant damage absolutely on demand when you need it every single time. You used to have this, they lined up once and then they'd be a disconnect and then you could line them back up again later should you be able to do that. Now you're just able to use them together all the time, which for all intents and purposes might as well just merge them into one spell. There's a real fear here. I mean, it's really nice, don't get me wrong. It's really nice to be able to stack those cooldowns up every single time. The fear here is it just kills two talent rows by having this option available of having Dark Soul and Dark Glare perfectly line up every single time. That's such a good combination to always have that it could dominate the entire thing. So this is really fun. Affliction is genuinely fun to do. You feel like a Warlock. I can tell you that from start to finish. You feel like everything you think of Warlocks, so certainly if you've ever watched the original World of Warcraft cutscenes, is you do feel like a Warlock. You feel like you're managing plagues, you're managing dots, you're doing all those kinds of things. So really happy to see this happening. Rapture. I will say Malefic Rapture, which attacks anything that has dots on it, regardless of range, etc. It still feels a little weak sauce to me single target. It doesn't feel like a really fun thing to use single target. When you're AoEing, it feels great. When you're popping entire, because that's essentially what you're doing. When you're popping entire packs of enemies that are all covered in dots, that feels really, really good. I still think it feels a little weak, and Drain Soul feels better to use during those periods of time. I still, personally, would like to see a standard return to either Shadow Bolt or Malefic Grasp, and then Drain Soul being just the standard execute for Affliction. I think that might be a good move, especially with these changes to Corruption, to Shadow Bolt, and as well to Nightfall, in order to bring those back into line. But that's my personal opinion. I'm sure you guys will have your own. So Affliction playing really wonderfully. Lots and lots of changes there. The two other specs, Destro and Demo, less changes, but let's take a look at them. So I'm going to do a Demonology first. A lot of people expecting a lot out of Demonology, but let's take a little look here. So they've tried to fix some of the issues and also some cheese that has been going on with the demo log. So if you're not sure, if you're thinking about playing Warlock for Shadowlands, there's been a lot of cheese going on with Demonology recently. It's certainly in terms of line of sighting and abusing imp spawn locations in order to produce massive demonic tyrants. Far larger than what were intended, but you'll definitely see lots of clips out there of Warlocks who have been doing this, and Blizzard wants to kind of rein that in and also add a little bit more thematically and potentially avoid some degeneracy that has been coming on with it. So they've rolled in Baleful Azerite. Now, I'm sure most of you actually, even if you've never watched this video, would go into Shadowlands and just not notice the difference, because Baleful Azerite, the Baleful Azerite trait has been something you've had since literally day one of Battle for Azeroth. That is, your tyrant now gives 5 shards. That is just what it does now. Okay, so it's been a required Azerite trait for so long that I'm sure that most people coming into Shadowlands would actually have had more surprise when they spawned their tyrant and didn't get 5 shards. So that's nice to see. They've tried to fix Dreadstalkers, which sometimes were too slow to even reach their target. There have been several occasions of people commenting that their Dreadstalkers that they spawned simply almost reached the target and then disappeared. But basically they charge now. So again, a little quality of life change. They move to the target and they become talented to cast entirely for free, which I know was a big frustration every time I played demo, was getting that proc at exactly the wrong time and not being able to cast them even though they had been procced. Now, in terms of the LOS cheese, the imp cheese and all that, this is what they've done to change demonic consumption. So it no longer kills your imps, okay, but now it will drain 15% HP of all your demons, every single one of your demons you have, to buff itself, okay, to buff up that tyrant. So what this does, it actually makes Grimoire Felguard and Vilefiend even better, all right? It makes them stronger, it's stronger. But it makes demonic consumption even more powerful than it already is, and it's already the best talent to take in that row. So it feels like they've kind of doubled down on killing that talent row with demonic consumption by making it simply better. And more consistent, okay? So that's one thing you want to bear in mind, although gameplay-wise, you're probably not going to notice too much difference there. One brilliant change, though, is imps now spawn almost instantly. I say almost, instead of like this weird staggered pattern that used to happen all the time. It is so much better. They'll also snap to the Warlock if they can't hit their target, which means that LOS cheese is probably dead. Now, I say almost instantly. It's not quite instantly, which means you can still run to that period of time where your imps are still spawning and you have to cast another spell, which you didn't want to cast because you wanted to utilize that imp spawn. Always getting those issues when you're trying to get a massive tyrant and imps are about to expire and you're waiting for the imps to actually appear. You know they're appearing, but they haven't spawned yet. All those kinds of issues. They've tried to make it better. It's not perfect, but it is an improvement for sure. Now, one of the bigger problems that demo locks have is they don't seem to do what they should be good at. And that is that most of Demonology's spells are based on clumped gathered adds, which means Demonology should be the go-to spec when it comes to things like Mythic Plus. You think about it, you're going to have a Felguard out, which brings the Blade Storm with it. You're going to be doing your Hand of Gul'dan, which does damage to packed, stacked enemies. That's the job. That's what they've done, but that's not what they've been doing. And a big issue with that still hasn't been addressed is the lack of interrupt that Demonology has. While it does have Axe Toss as a stun, it just lacks basic interrupt functionality that the other Warlock specs bring. And anybody who's doing Mythic Plus, even not extreme ends, and often what I find is people go, well, that only matters if you're doing Mythic Plus 29 or some fucking ridiculous bullshit that they've never been anywhere near and actually don't know what they're talking about. Being able to interrupt is important from Mythic 3 onwards, right? If you think it's okay that your tank keeps getting smashed and you keep dying to spellcasts, then, you know, that's on you. But it doesn't mean being able to interrupt is not important by any means. So overall, that is basically the summary of the Demonology changes. Most of it is more fixes and quality of life improvements, but no overall change in direction of what Demonology is all about. It's still very similar. You're going to notice very similar gameplay. There's just some slight twists and turns here to basically try and fix the issues it has now without really addressing the core issues that Demonology has or its core place inside of the Warlock talent arsenal. And that's kind of that's where they're leaving it right now, and hopefully we'll see a little bit more to address those issues. If we take a look over at Destro then, some interesting changes here to try and make it less about being inside of the Tyrant, not the Tyrant, the Infernal window, which is where a lot of Destro Warlocks feel far too much of their damage exists, is inside of that Infernal window, smoothing it out. Because one thing we've definitely noticed over the course of Shadowlands and indeed BFA and indeed Legion is this push to make casters really ridiculously strong during specific little windows and then spending an absurd amount of time outside of that window just not being anywhere near as effective. Fire mages would be the prime example of that, no doubt. So what they've tried to do is rejig Destro a little bit so it's more powerful outside of these cooldowns while still being pretty powerful inside those cooldowns as well. So one of the first changes is Roaring Blaze, which now causes Conflag to debuff. Alright, something so important is a debuff. It's not a buff on the Warlock, it is a debuff. To increase all fire damage dealt by that Warlock to that target by 30%. It's decent. It's a little fiddly. It's 6-second window, so you can't do too much inside it. There's not a lot you could do. So if you take Soulfire, then you can do a Soulfire Incinerate combo. If you happen to have gone Necrolord, which boosts your Incinerate damage massively, then you can do some huge things there. Generally speaking, though, not too amazing. You can Havoc it. So if you Havoc Conflag, it will debuff both the targets so that you can fire them in there. But it has some play, but it's coming up against some really, really, really good talents inside that window, like Eradication and, of course, Flashover, which generally just feel better. It's one of those things that might have a place, but if it's coming next to Flashover and Eradication, it's going to struggle a little bit, especially when more haste values come into play. So we'll see how it goes there. A really awkward one for me, certainly as an old school Warlock, I'm definitely less versed in modern Warlock than I am old school Warlock, is that Shadowburn now gets more crits when the target has lower HP, but it now costs a shard instead of generating one. It feels wrong in the fingers. Let me put it that way. It feels wrong in the fingers that it works that way. Again, I don't know why they're trying to reinvent the wheel here with what Shadowburn is. And we often do see signs of where Blizzard is trying to reinvent the wheel in some way. Shadowburn is Shadowburn, and it has its place if you're doing certain things, and is quite nice. And they're trying to rejig it, maybe give it a fresh coat of paint, and it just feels odd. Honestly, it just feels very, very strange. Grimoire of Supremacy. Okay, so a little warning about this, and the conversation we had amongst me and Finn before we recorded is, we are going to show this. Really, really unlikely this is going to stay in the game because it is broken. B-R-O-K-E-N. Broken. But I have to talk about it in case it does make it into the game in some form or another. So, Grimoire of Supremacy has been changed to Reign of Chaos. Yes, indeed, Warcraft fans. Okay, so let me explain this clearly. When your initial Infernal is active, right? So when you cast Infernal as Destruction, your nice Infernal, you have a 15% chance per shard spent while that initial Infernal is down. All right, so he's down for 30 seconds, yeah? So in that 30-second window, 15% chance per shard spent to summon another Infernal for 10 seconds. Alarm bells be ringing because this snowballs like mad, particularly if you get an Infernal to spawn and one of the first spell casts you do, because this works in tangent with those Infernals, which feels wrong. It feels like it shouldn't do that. What this means is each Infernal can start spawning more Infernals. And this means that you can rack up a huge, well, not a huge stack, because it's actually limited by the totem meter. It actually falls into the totem bar on your character, which means you can only have a certain amount up. But if you have good luck, and this is basically what this comes down to, if you have really good luck, you can get waves of Infernals, and they're just constantly flooding your character with embers and shards. So you can just Chaos Bolt, Chaos Bolt. In fact, you can do so many, it's actually worth throwing down more single target Rain of Fires in order to spend more shards to spawn more Infernals, which will just replace the older Infernals as their time is running out. And it's the only way you can kind of manage it. It snowballs like crazy. On the opposite side, sometimes you don't get any. So you have this one talent which can either give you a ludicrously large DPS increase because Infernals actually, the crash damage they do has been buffed significantly. It almost hits as hard as a Chaos Bolt when an Infernal lands. They buff that damage. These Infernals also do that damage. Not on top of that, the Infernal stun also applies to these Infernals that are coming crashing down, and they do not DR. That means you can quite literally lock down an entire pack of enemies for over 30 seconds if you have good luck. You literally just spam stun them constantly as Infernals rain from the sky. Now, one thing I'll say is this looks really, really cool. I think it doesn't need removing or anything like that. It just needs some adjustment. Each of the Infernals that lands shouldn't stun. They shouldn't come with the stun. And they should also make it a consistent number of spawns. I think Reign of Chaos should literally summon one every few seconds over its 30-second duration. And it should be used more of a Chaos Bolt battery. So it just gives you consistent Chaos Bolt spam during there. Might be a better way to go about it. But right now, this thing is either insanely good or really, really bad. Which is having talents in the tree that sometimes are just incredible and sometimes garbage never feels good. If we look even towards some of the Covenant abilities that sometimes do well and sometimes don't, we just don't want them. Consistency is everything. If I'm going to pop my DPS cooldowns, I want to know that I'm going to put out around X amount of damage. It's important. It gets really important. What I don't want is one that can do 1 billion damage or can do nothing at all for me. Because it's a 15% per shard. You can get really unlucky, get 1, maybe 0. sometimes you're going to get 7, 8, 9, and it just keeps spawning them and spawning them and spawning them, and you're doing so much more damage. So it's something that Blizzard wants to bear in mind there. It probably needs some tweaking. I'm sure they're aware of it. We've reported it and also suggested some other things. It's nice if it's like a Chaos Bolt Charger. That's fine. But with the way it is now, it's pretty wacky. They also buff Rain of Fire damage by 30% at level 56. As you level up, you should be aware of this, is you are going to get some spell upgrades, some better than others. Talk to the Shadow Priest about that. Like Havoc Duration gets a 2-second improvement at level 54. Oh, good. They have tried to boost Soulfire, so it's now a 4-second cast that does 300% spell power. So I mentioned earlier with Roaring Blaze that it's getting that extra boost of damage. But as I mentioned earlier, I actually realize now I get the talents mixed up. Roaring Blaze is down next to Reign of Chaos, which obviously at the moment you would just take Reign of Chaos and nobody would take Gosek under any circumstances. But it's actually Soulfire that's down on the first row that is going up against Eradication and Flashover. Soulfire just doesn't fit at the moment. It's just not enough. Even with it generating a shard, it's too long of a cast. It's a 3.6 second cast at the moment. Its damage is decent, but again, it's going, as I mentioned earlier, if you translate what I said about Roaring Blaze into Eradication and Flashover, it just doesn't fit. It doesn't feel like it fits in there, which is a real shame. I think going to proc Soulfires or something like that that generates extra shards might be way more interesting, because Soulfire is a great spell to cast, but unfortunately it doesn't quite fit. Overall, it's okay. I wasn't even expecting them to do anything with Destro. I've said that a few times. They're pretty happy with how Destruction works. So to see some tweaking, cool. Okay, that's still pretty good. Still think Demonology needs some work. But right now, the changes to Destruction have caused it to do, with the right talent setups as I just explained, absolutely absurd damage. Sometimes. Sometimes it does absurd damage. So that's how the Warlock's looking right now in Shadowlands, guys. Plenty for you to take in there. I hope that's good enough, and we'll see how they keep doing these changes as time goes on. We're likely to see them do a whole series of class changes going forward. We've had some to Druid, Warrior, Warlock. We'll see what we get this week when Blizzard inevitably does a little bit more. Thank you so much for listening, guys. I'll see you again. Bye-bye.